Monochromatic is a term my professor from university used to drone on about. A monochrome painting is one, unsurprisingly, composed from a single color. She would say that art is a holistically selfish practice, one that draws on our self-perception and translates our emotions. She would say that art, by and large, was meant to be drawn, but that monochromatic art was meant to be seen. That is because, according to her, monochromatic art carries an intrinsic appeal harmonious to humanity's desire for simplicity. It is possible I am misremembering exactly what she said. This was years ago, and I was a literature student after all, but I do remember what my response was. I told her, "The last kind of painting I want to look at is the kind that tries to appeal to me. It's just too creepy." I don't think she liked me, but I'm sure she would be pleased to know that I think about that lecture all these years later. Anyway, when I woke up that morning, everything appeared monochromatic. An orange sunrise crested over a particularly large dune in the horizon. The shifting landscape of the desert made it difficult to distinguish the wind-blown sands from the heat-bred haze headed by the sun, breaking abreast the hill. The sun's influence on the desert was infectious, the sand sucking in its blood-orange tincture like a damp rag. "Wake up," I said to the sleeping minnow, giving a light kick. The brittle boy stirred from his rest. He was half my age, with a thin jaw and lanky bird limbs. Malnourishment wasn't uncommon, but it was hard to believe they would ship someone out in that condition. More than that, it was becoming painfully obvious to me that he barely knew anything about the desert. He woke with the visceral panic exclusive to a person's jolting awake from unintentional sleep. "God, I'm so sorry, Salmon. I must have nodded off." "Calm down," I said. "Lookouts this far inland are just routine. Nothing here wants to bother us anyway." Nothing could be further from the truth, but he didn't need me to tell him. His features stiffened. "Still, hey, when David hunts Goliath, he does so with gusto, yeah?" He sat up with a non-committal grunt, noticing the sunrise for the first time. "Whoa." "Yep. Take it in, little minnow. They don't call it the Red Sea for nothing. Soon it'll be too much for us without goggles." "It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen, Salmon." I narrowed my eyes. "It's a bastard, and the more you look, the deeper the whale wriggles your will away. I've only been doing this for 6 years, and it's already got my number. Just remember, a job that pays this well is not one you want to retire early from." Right. You're right. I'm sorry, Salmon. You know, I've been wondering this for a while now. Shouldn't the desert whales be affected by the whale as well? Who knows? Maybe that's the reason they never shut up. I motioned to my mute. Sons of bitches never learned that looking at the sun is really just about the worst thing you can do in this place. Or who knows? Maybe the whale nourishes them. That must be miserable. Just wandering the desert, not knowing why you're in so much pain? I mean, that's their whole life, Salmon. If you're really that worried about it, you can just think of it like we're here to put them out of their misery. I chuckled to myself. Like we're just regular humanitarians. Minnow fumbled with some heavier equipment as he got his suit on. Sounds reasonable, I suppose. I wouldn't rely too much on me, I said. Where did they pull your ass out of, anyway? I'm from Wales. Welsh? Well, that's certainly a coincidence. Interestingly enough, I also boast Welsh descent. What part's about? I glanced at his gutter-rat body. I'd bet against Cardiff. You'd lose that bet, Salmon. Damn, I never meet Welsh people who aren't from Cardiff. I'm very sorry to hear that, Salmon. Do not call me Salmon. Call me Ishmael, I tried to joke. Ishmael, Salmon? You know, like the book. Afraid I've never heard of it, Ishmael. No, please. I rubbed my temples. Don't call me that. Salmon is fine. I swear, it's like nobody's even heard of American books. They're not all that bad. You read a lot of American books then, Salmon? Asked Minnow. Not as much as I did, but it's what I was planning to study in university. What happened? I looked at Minnow's hollow face. What always happens? Ah, just get your shit and get moving. The desert did not waste time, and the 12-degree increase on my wrist thermometer was just a prelude to the viciousness of the vast waste. Our suits resembled scuba gear if you weren't looking very closely. Thick, pliable material served as the insulator, creating an endothermic barrier between us and the outside. For how haggard and cheap the equipment appeared, the design was actually very clever. The suit used solar energy from the heat displacement to power its other various accompanying gadgets. The thermometer, wind pressure gauge, and short-range radio were all powered by the sun, to name a few. We quickly stuffed our camp into our travel sacks, suited up, and headed off. With our helmets on, we could only talk through short-range radio, but the Wale scrambled the radio, and it was nearly impossible to hear through, so conversation was sparse. Only the essentials. As we trudged through the desert, the heat was like an extra weight that bore down on us like a wet towel. I checked the device on my wrist that measured wind pressure. I looked up at the sun. Not even a cloud for our trouble. I flipped on the radio, my helmet returning what Minnow heard as a feedback loop as I tried to speak through the frill of static. Wind, raising fast. Need to tie, get the cord. Miraculously, Minnow took my meaning and fished through his bag for the long, rope-like metal cord, fastening it to his belt. The hook found its mark with a satisfying click. He sluggishly tossed me my end of the cord, clearly encumbered by his suit. The cable landed at my feet with a muffled thud. I picked it up and found the latch on my own belt, quickly fastening it. I gave the cord one final tug before I motioned to Minnow for us to continue. In the Red Sea, the wind rose with the sun, and soon enough a sandstorm started cresting on the horizon. Winds whipped at the sand, kicking up clouds of dust into a massive wall hundreds of feet high, stretching endlessly in either direction. I checked my thermometer, 138 degrees. I could feel the heat at the edge of my suit trying to break through the artificial cooling. The sun was like a corrosive poison bearing down on us. I flipped on the radio, motioning for Minnow to do the same. Get ready. Turn, get, mute, ready. I repeated the phrase several times until what I wanted to hear came back through the feedback loop. It took no time for the massive cloud to reach us. I saw a speck of feathers at the storm front. It looked to be a bird frantically fleeing the fray. I imagined looking from the bird's perspective. We must have looked like 2 more grains of sand fueling the desert soaked in fire. The enormity of the sand wall made me feel seabound, like a wave too high to see over about to crash us down to the depths. The howl of the wind pulsed through my eardrums like blood. I turned on my mute and felt the world drain out of my head like a bad dream. The silence was almost as deafening as the storm. We kept walking forward. The wind wrapped around us like a blanket, the dust depriving us of sight. Experiencing the full brunt of a Red Sea sandstorm under the sedation of sight and sound was truly surreal. Like trying to walk underwater, barely able to breathe. Amidst the fierce gales of sand, the only thing keeping me grounded to reality was the cable connecting me to Minnow, which I was gripping with fairly certainly white knuckles. The worst-case scenario involved the cable unlatching in the intense winds. Time seemed to slip away without me noticing, and I could barely feel how tired I was getting. Suddenly, the frantic scene of the suffocating sandstorm screeched to a stilted stop, replaced by the silky voice of a singing siren somewhere off in a distant place. No, I thought. Not the Wale. Not now. The thick, bloody oranges of the harsh wind softly slid into blue and white hues. My suit, designed to keep the heat of the desert out, now worked against me as the freeze of a blizzard replaced the swelter of the sand. One glance at my thermometer's glow of dull digits showed the temperature plummeting at a ridiculous pace. The cold shuddered through my entire body, my frigid fingers on the fringes of freezing and falling off. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. I kept repeating the phrase, though my self-assurances were appropriately deafened by my own mute. The cord attached to my belt suddenly tightened, burdening my progress. My first thought was that I was outpacing Minnow, but reality was crueler. Minnow had collapsed in the storm, now only serving as my personal anchor. It wouldn't be long before the storm buried me, and the cold kept getting worse. I turned around, using the wire between us to trace my way towards Minnow. He had nearly frozen over. I reminded myself that he was buried in sand, not snow, as I dug my fingers into the heap of ice to dig him out. I acted stiffly and numbly. I didn't have the wherewithal to form cohesive thoughts. Mustering all the strength that I could, I gathered him up in my arms and threw him over my shoulder. I realized, when my throat started burning, that I had been screaming for some time. Each step was a lumbering ache. Days could have passed, and I wouldn't have known. My mind was numb from the cold, and time slipped away from me over and over again. But I kept walking. Eventually, the storm stopped. I stopped too. Fragments of dust and sand swirled in the air as the maelstrom regressed into a dry breeze. Once I returned to my senses, I felt a wave of heat lurch over my body like a migraine. I wanted to check the time or the temperature, turn my mute off or take a sip of water, but I was too tired. I collapsed under the weight of Minnow, sleep taking hold of me. When I woke up, Minnow was sitting across from me, nervously fidgeting with a small contraption. I saw his lips moving, but no sound came out. My mute was still on. I could feel a stinging in my ears and knew they were damaged. I flipped my mute off, and the world came crashing down like a wave to my chest. The return of sound was dizzying, and I started panting, feeling the noise barging its way into my stomach in a thundering nausea. Minnow stopped in the middle of whatever he was saying. "Was your mute on this whole time? Shit, I'm sorry, I should have turned it off. I didn't even think." "Yeah," I said, "you should have. But it's fine." It was not fine. "I was just so worried about you, Salmon. After you collapsed in that storm, I had to drag you for miles and miles. After a while, I just couldn't. When I woke up, you were still asleep. I guess it's been about 30 minutes since then." "What?" I said. "Are you having a fucking laugh, Minnow? Because I almost died dragging your sorry ass out of the mud, and you have done nothing to help either of us since we got in the desert." I've never heard such blubbering nonsense. Minnow looked stunned. "What? But that's really what happened. You passed out or something." I could barely hear Minnow through the ringing in my ears, but my blood was boiling. "You've got it backwards, little Minnow. I told you not to look at the sun. The whale is already playing tricks on you." "But, Salmon, That's enough. This is the last I want to hear of it." I looked at the sun. It would set soon, dyeing the land in orange. "You didn't even make camp. I didn't know when you were going to wake up." "We'll sleep here and get back to it tomorrow. This time, I'm expecting you to stay awake through your watch. We can't get caught in a storm like that while sleeping. You think you can handle that one, little Minnow?" "Right then," he said quietly. "I'll take first watch." As the sun sank and the moon rose, pale blue light seeped into the desert's palette. But the orange never left my eyes. I didn't sleep at all during Minnow's watch. Eventually, he tapped my shoulder, but I already knew it was my turn. I had been counting the minutes. Minnow collapsed into sleep within seconds. I spent a long time looking at him. His suit didn't fit him. He was so feeble. Feeble enough, I thought I might break him with a touch. I was surprised the winds of the storm hadn't blown him away. The night felt safe. Stars glistened in the sky, each feeling so much less oppressive than the cankerous sun that swallowed the Red Sea every day. The moon was there too, but it never seemed as impressive, like a silver plate waning with a chipped edge. I always wondered if a moon was waning or waxing when I saw it hang in the sky. It doesn't really matter. Ideally, we could travel in the company of the moon, but hunting at night would be an exercise in futility. Whales burrow underground to sleep. The winds made the burrows completely traceless, so we would just be walking in circles. My personal theory is that the whales hated the moon, but I don't know. I looked back at Minnow. Should I abandon him? Maybe. He was a hindrance that put us both in peril. What if we both died because of a mistake he made? The way things were going, Minnow would get me killed before long. What if a storm came? Would it be better to just leave him and let the desert take its toll? There was a rumor I read in the archives that said if someone died in the Red Sea while sleeping, no one would remember them ever being alive. That theory was worth testing. It would be the first contribution Minnow would make in our journey. But there would be no way to test the theory if I forgot about him. Even if it wasn't true, there would be no fallout. Accidents happen all the time, and nobody is important enough to search for them in the Red Sea, much less a poor little Minnow. Nobody had looked for me. I had to survive and come back on my own. Maybe that's what Minnow needed, a strong push to survive. I grabbed my canteen and shook it to confirm the water sloshing inside. Then I opened the cap and poured it onto Minnow's head. He woke with a jolt, his head darting in every direction until the glint in his eyes focused on me. What are you doing, Salmon? Are you completely mental? It's not even dawn yet. Oh, come now, little Minnow. I know it is wet and the sun is not sunny, but we can have lots of good fun that is funny. Minnow shook his head. What have you done? We need that water. I only really need half. So you're threatening me now? I'm just asking you to try a little harder. Minnow looked at me with hard eyes. I will, Salmon. The seriousness of his tone jolted me out of my sleepless stupor, and I nodded. The morning arrived. I watched the sunrise a bit before finishing the day's preparations. The sun lumbered over the horizon like it did every day, the burning monstrosity painting the desert in light little by little. We got into our morning routine of gearing up and tearing down camp. Conversation was sparse. We began walking right as the sun fully reared out from behind the horizon, the herald of another suffocating day of blistering heat. My bones ached and my joints were tight. Every step in the sand I could feel the desert clutching at my ankles. If I slowed down, even a little, the desert would devour me. The call of a desert whale could be heard from miles away, but it wasn't a good idea to listen for long. Unlike the whales I read about in textbooks, the ones from ages past where seas were filled with water instead of sand, whose songs were sonically subtle and unperceivable by human ears, desert whales would burst eardrums in a matter of seconds up close. While useful to drown out the howling winds of sandstorms, our mute's primary purpose was to protect us from the whales. The land itself shook under their tremulous roar. Once I heard the call in the distance, I radioed for Minnow to put his mute on. Miraculously, the radio wasn't receiving any interference. My ears were still pounding, and the idea of using my mute did not excite me without knowing the full extent of their damage. I figured it wouldn't be too bad if we got a little closer before turning my own mute on. It wasn't long before the whale came into view. In the distance, it looked so tiny, but I knew better. It was a lumbering creature with a surprisingly regal quality. This was its territory, and we were intruders. It moved across the sand like a colossal slug, very slowly, its bulbous fat working to hide the thousands of scuttling barb-like legs beneath its belly. Its piercing eyes were lifelessly locked on the sun, seemingly unaware of our intrusion. "Are you ready, Salmon?" asked Minnow mildly. "Your mute should be on, Minnow." "Yours should too, Salmon. But instead of talking about our mutual dislike for safety equipment, let's instead talk shop on how we're going to do our job." I clenched my teeth. "Fine then." I pulled out the elbow rifle from my bag. "The name of the game is speed. Shoot as many times as you can, as fast as you can. The sooner the poison kicks in, the less time the whale has to mess with you." "You mean whale," said Minnow as he rummaged for his elbow rifle. "That's what I said." "You said whale. You meant whale." What are you talking about? The radio suddenly picked up static as Minnow spoke. What in... Right, just as long as we're clear. Fine, yes, whatever. Can we please start moving? Wait for my signal, then we charge. Minnow gave me a thumbs up. The sheer volume of the whale's never-ending bellow gnawed at my nerves like a ravenous pack of rats. Soon it would be unsafe, if it wasn't already. I glanced at the sun's ensnaring beauty one more time, letting it engulf my senses. I took a deep breath and said, Minnow, the game's afoot. The roar of the whale was so close that it hurt. I flipped my mute on, plunging into silence once again. I started sprinting, not waiting for Minnow to respond. I let loose a hail of bullets, each shot invisible to my ears. I had 10 shots, all of them lethally laced in poison. The whale's attention finally wandered over to me. The shots did little physical damage to its hide, but the poison would soon begin rapidly degrading its organs. It was another example of our equipment doubling in purpose. The buyers didn't need those insides intact anyway. They typically tossed that stuff back in the desert once it was gutted. I ran out of bullets in no time, but I was sure I hit it with at least a few. All I would have to do now is wait. Time to run. But the first step I took away from the whale, the sand grasped my ankles like a vice, halting my retreat. I looked back at the whale, and it was staring directly at me, its glazed eyes uncaring. I began sinking, deeper and deeper, until the desert had completely buried me. My throat burned as my suit melted away, leaving me unprotected. Sand began streaming into my mouth in wounds. As I sunk deeper into the ground, the sand blew me up like a balloon, stretching my skin beyond its natural limits. Sand burst out of my throat, muffling the silent screams which had been the only response I could muster. I would burst any second. When I did, I found myself inside something, slimy and difficult to balance in. It was too dark to see anything, but I could tell I no longer had my suit or any equipment. A deep moan seemed to emanate from deep within the darkness. Streams of sunlight fluttered in as the whale's maw opened to let loose a tremendous roar. My ears popped violently as my entire body vibrated and my heart vigorously pounded. I couldn't take it, but the shout didn't stop. It roared on for minutes, leaving me unable to move, think, or feel anything but pain. I would burst any second. When I did, I was in an open field. Pleasant grass wisped by with the breeze. Minnow was in front of me, and I had a gun. Since it felt like the right thing to do, given the circumstance, I shot him. When I did, I was laying on the ground, my senses immobilized by the mute. I heaved myself up, my joints aching everywhere. When I looked up, the whale was dead, and Minnow was nowhere to be seen. I called for him, but he didn't come. Good riddance. I walked to the whale and touched its eye. It was slimy and surprisingly malleable. It wasn't as scary up close. It wasn't special. Nothing is special after it dies, because it's dead. Then I laughed, because it was funny.